Tonight on Bridge City News, here are some of the top stories we've been following. Dr. Theresa Tam says COVID-19 is on a runaway rise in most of the country. Ontario lowers thresholds to impose stricter COVID-19 measures. And U.S. officials hail progress on a vaccine as cases surge in the United States.
Your nation. Your province. Your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News, Weekend Edition.
Thank you for joining us. Dr. Theresa Tam says COVID-19 is on a runaway rise in most of the country as the seasons for both holidays and colds and flu approach. Tam says strict public health rules might help, but nothing is more important than following those rules and being extra cautious, especially if people hope to have any sort of gatherings at Christmas.
If we don't cut down contacts by 25%, in some areas even more than that, then the growth will continue. So that's the sort of fundamental principles and concepts. The other concept that the Prime Minister also said is to act quickly. And then be really careful when you are relaxing at the other end, because what will happen is that given winter is coming, people going indoors, you may see a rise again. So this yo-yoing and up and down is really very difficult for society and for individuals. So, as jurisdictions, make a concerted effort to flatten the curve, got to be really careful about emerging from that side once you flatten the curve.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford says the province is updating its color-coded system for imposing COVID-19 restrictions in light of alarming new projections.
If we don't change course in a big way, Ontario is on track for 6,500 new cases per day. And based on current projections, intensive care units could be overwhelmed in 6 weeks. The impact on our hospitals would be absolutely devastating. We're updating our COVID-19 framework with new thresholds. We see the numbers rapidly increasing. Dr. Williams has also updated his advice to everyone who lives in the red control zones. Limit your trips outside of the home except essential reasons, like going to work, school, getting groceries, keeping a medical appointment, or exercising. Work remotely where possible. Families should not, I repeat, not visit any other households or allow visitors to their homes. And please avoid social gatherings. These adjustments, they're necessary to respond to the latest evidence. 9 days, 10 days ago, what I saw was anywhere from 950 to 1,200 cases. What I saw a couple days ago, it's 6,500. And I can reassure you that if I saw 6,500 cases 10 days ago, I wouldn't be out here today saying what we're saying.
U.S. President Donald Trump and administration officials offered an update on a vaccine for COVID-19. Trump delivered his first public remarks since his defeat by President-elect Joe Biden.
The American people can be comforted with all the news this week that help is on the way, that literally pending FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine and perhaps very soon another vaccine that will be submitted by Moderna and even other companies that before the year is out, we'll be able to administer a vaccine to tens of millions of Americans, as you've said, Mr. President, beginning with those most vulnerable, beginning with our seniors all across this country, beginning with our healthcare workers and first responders at the point of the need.
Thanks to the support he's provided, we're now on track to deliver a safe and effective vaccine to our most vulnerable this year. Right now is not the time to let our guard down. We continue to encourage Americans to follow the 3 W's. Wash your hands, watch your distance, wear a mask when you can't watch your distance, and avoid settings where you can't do those things.
November is Canada Career Month. Even in the midst of COVID-19, StatsCan says there have been employment increases in several industries, one of which is real estate. Bridge City News spoke with a leading real estate broker as to why becoming a realtor was so rewarding.
If it's in your heart to make a change, there's never a better time than right now. There's never a convenient time to do anything. Someone once told me about having children. The best time to have children is when you feel like it. If you wait till you're ready, you'll never have them. If you wait till you have enough money, you'll never have them. And it's the same with the change in careers. To me, the interesting things about real estate are that, first of all, in many cases, it's commission-based, and that just turns a lot of people off and it scares a lot of people. But if you're a self-starter and you're driven and you're keen to serve people at a really high level, it can be one of the greatest careers on the planet. And the greatest thing about it is that the barriers to entry are fairly low. It does take some money to get licensed, and it does take a fair amount of time and intelligence and hard work to get through the course. But ultimately, there's lots of resources out there to be successful once you are licensed and ready to go.
The Alberta Real Estate Association says there are now over 10,500 realtors and brokers across the province. 2 Alberta farmers have taken legal action against Beau Energy Limited over allegedly delinquent annual lease agreement payments. According to the class action lawsuit filed by Wolf Coutts on behalf of property owners in Alberta, drilling for oil and gas has resulted in significant damage to his land and the land of others. He says the Calgary-based company has failed to provide compensation as outlined in their contract.
What we're looking for here is fairness. There's a deal. You're supposed to be paying these individuals, and you're not. And so what we're doing is something called a class action. And what happens in a class action is that one person needs to stand up and say, this is wrong. What is happening here is wrong. And I am an example of what's happening being wrong. So use me as an example. And if you agree that what has been happening to me is in fact wrong, there are many other people who are in the same situation, and the court should help them too.
A deal is a deal. Without payment and the ongoing entry onto our land, my wife and I, along with many other landowners in Alberta, had no other option other than to pursue legal avenues. There are many, many family farms and landowners that have been forced into a position of weakness, hence cannot defend themselves against these large corporations.
A Colehurst, Alberta man who beat cancer is now running across the province, raising awareness of the deadly disease. As video journalist Micah Quinn explains, he'll be receiving support from friends each and every step of the way.
10 years ago, Tyson Janczewski was diagnosed with testicular cancer, and he has since won his fight against it. Janczewski is running to inform people about cancer and to raise funds for research.
It's going to be interesting because I feel like I'm going to learn some new things about myself. On a family level, in the last 10 years, I lost my grandma to cancer, and just recently this year, I lost my uncle.
The run will start on November 14th at the BC border, where Janczewski will take the number 3 highway all the way to the Trans-Canada Highway and ending in Medicine Hat.
So the run's 201 miles. I think that's like 326 kilometers or something like that. So I don't know how long the run's actually going to be. I've never ran 200 miles before, but we're going to take it by feel, and we're just going to go at our own pace.
Janczewski's friend, Ryan Thornley, will join him for the run, along with other close friends. This run holds a personal meaning for Thornley.
Just 2 days ago now that I lost a long-term friend of mine to cancer, just early in the morning on Tuesday. And yeah, so the run for me has sort of taken on this new shape. It sort of started as something that I wanted to support Tyson in raising awareness for cancer research and funding. But now, it's partly carrying on that legacy of a friend of mine, doing something that kind of makes meaning out of what he went through.
Janczewski has raised over $5,000 through the Terry Fox Foundation for cancer research. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Recapping one of her top news stories, Dr. Theresa Tam says COVID-19 is on a significant rise in most of the country as Christmas and cold and flu season approach. And a look at weekend weather. A bit of snowfall left to go today before we're into milder weather again. Tonight, just a few clouds with a southwest wind gusting from 30 to 50 and a low of -9. For tomorrow, mainly sunny skies with wind gusting 40 to 60 near noon and a high of +5. After the break, catch our interview with Carol Crossan, a constitutional lawyer in Calgary. She will discuss how her client, Lethbridge and District's Pro-Life, won its court case against the city of Lethbridge in a fight to run pro-life ads on bus benches and shelters.
Abortion is legal in Canada, but it's not a settled issue, as some claim. A sizable number of Canadians still oppose the termination of the unborn, but now the question is, do these people have the right to freely express their opinions? A recent court decision in Lethbridge ruled in favor of free speech. Our guest today is Carol Crossan, a Calgary constitutional lawyer who's been representing Lethbridge and District Pro-Life in their court case with the city of Lethbridge. She joins me now via Skype from Airdrie. Carol, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hi, nice to be with you.
Carol, can you maybe share some of the backstory with our viewers about this case?
Certainly, Jeanette. Well, this started a few years ago when my client, Lethbridge Pro-Life, approached the city inquiring as to posting an ad called Preborn Babies Feel Pain on bus benches and on the exterior of buses. And the city initially agreed after some time. It took about 14 months for the city to agree, but the city eventually posted that ad. And shortly thereafter, the city pulled the ad, and the city said its reasons for pulling the ad was on the basis of adverse community reaction. And so Lethbridge Pro-Life attempted to work back and forth with the city to find out how it could adjust the ad and to negotiate with the city on reposting the ad. Eventually, when that proved fruitless, Lethbridge Pro-Life approached the city with 5 new ads. And those ads ranged anything from captions saying, human rights should not depend upon where you are, with a picture of a pregnant woman on one side of the ad and the same woman holding a baby on the other side of the ad, an ad with me, again, still me, 3 pictures of unborn children, and then finally a healthy newborn child on the other side of the ad. Equality should begin in the womb, with a picture of a pregnant woman. Birth did not transform me into a child, with a picture of a healthy little baby. And life should be the most fundamental human right. So those were the 5 ads at issue, and the city rejected those ads for a variety of reasons. And because of that rejection, Lethbridge Pro-Life went to court, filed a notice of application for a judicial review of that decision. That came before the court in October of last year. And we just received the decision from the court, a 48-page decision with some wonderful gems, I must say, Jeanette, on the right to freedom of expression.
So the court ruled in your favor then, right, declaring that the city of Lethbridge acted unreasonably when it banned the ads.
Yes, that's true. And the court did for a variety of reasons. And the reasons give us some wonderful content for the right to free speech, not only in regard to those who are sharing a message about abortion, but those who are sharing really any kind of message across Canada. So coming out and saying that every individual has the right to freedom of expression, even if people complain about the message, that every individual in Canada has a right to free speech, even if people are upset with what they say, that the right to free speech exists even if some believe that the message is inaccurate. The court said that government can't rely solely on a private regulator or private opinion in order to reject free speech, and that government must act in an unbiased fashion, not take the side of one side of a message to the exclusion of another. It's a wonderful ruling for individuals all across the country.
No, but wasn't there a complaint that the ads were misleading and contained inaccurate information? What was the ruling on that?
Well, the court really gave us some strong content on that. The court said that inaccuracy is not a basis to prohibit free speech. In fact, the court said that there is no support for the idea that expression must be widely accepted, accurate, or scientifically verifiable in order to be protected. And that's an important issue right now, Jeanette, where our society really has a big focus on false news or inaccuracy. And so if an individual has to prove that their opinion, and this is just opinion, is accurate in order for that opinion to be protected, that's a bar that few individuals could ever meet.
And it seems that there's many in our society that feel that if unpopular and offensive viewpoints are expressed, and if there's a public outcry, then shutting down those opinions is justified. So did the judge have anything to say about that?
Well, the judge agreed that the right to free speech is for the majority opinion. He said that freedom of expression is meant to protect minority opinions from being drowned out by the majority. And he also spoke to the issue of upset, because there's the idea often that you have the right to free speech unless you offend someone or upset someone. Well, he said the opposite. He said that a strong and healthy democracy requires a willingness on the part of the public to accept that the expression of opinion and ideas may at times shock, offend, and even disturb people.
Oh, interesting.
He came out very strong, but his opinion does not vary from the jurisprudence in Canada on free speech. It in fact strongly accords with that jurisprudence. That's what the court has said for years.
Okay, now the court also found that the city was biased because in part the city only looked at the negative responses to the ads and didn't take into consideration positive responses as well. So any idea why government bodies seem to do this so often?
I think sometimes the state loses sight of the fact that they're to be neutral on issues, and sometimes perhaps their personal opinions play into their decision making. And so this decision is a return to the idea that the state has a duty to remain neutral on these issues and to treat both parties fairly.
What are the options now for Lethbridge Pro-Life? Can they now freely run the ads again, or could the city once again refuse to allow them?
Well, Lethbridge Pro-Life now will go back to the city and apply to run those ads. And that's usually the result of a judicial review application that's successful.
Okay, interesting. So how do you respond to the argument that free speech has limits? The issue of free speech isn't limited to just this topic, of course. There are so many other controversial issues, right?
Right. Well, free speech does have its limits. And in the court judgment, Justice Gates referred to those limits in referencing another case at the Alberta Court of Appeal. And in that case, the justice said that speech that breaks the law, illegal speech, is not permitted under our Constitution. And this in no way was illegal, hateful speech. It didn't breach the criminal code. It didn't breach human rights legislation. And so those are the appropriate limits that apply to freedom of expression.
And then talking about like how there's so many other controversial issues out there. So there's been issues where university professors, for example, are being suspended or fired for simply inviting civil debate and discussion. So why does this kind of thing seem to scare academic leaders? This used to be what universities were all about, right?
Yes, it's very unfortunate, Jeanette, and a lot of what I do is litigation in the area of free speech. And it's unfortunate when society starts to move in the direction of muzzling viewpoints that personal individuals, they feel are upsetting or offensive, or they don't accord with their message, because the very lifeblood of a democracy is the exchange of ideas. Justice Gates cited an old case in the judgment where he says, history has repeatedly demonstrated that the first step taken by totalitarian regimes is to muzzle the media and then the individual in order to prevent the dissemination of views and opinions that may be contrary to those of the government. We don't want to see that happen, because that same judgment said, if these exchanges are stifled, democratic government is threatened. The only way we move ahead in society is if people feel free to have civil debate on issues. And in the past, that's how we've progressed. At the time certain messages come out, they're often not appreciated, and there is some pushback, but our society progresses when we move ahead. We think of many of the movements in the past that at their time there was a lot of upset created. I think of the civil rights movement, I think of the suffragette movement. A lot of the issues that now we accept, issues to do with racism and equal treatment, that we accept there should be equality and fairness, because individuals years ago spoke out when there was some pushback and some change was made because of it. We can't afford not to let voices today speak out in like manner.
I think you just answered my next question. So if the movement towards stifling debate and free speech should actually prevail in Canada, what would the consequences be for our society?
Well, I think the consequences, Jeanette, would be that we as guardians of the gate, those who are trying to protect these long-held fundamental freedoms, would see the erosion of those freedoms. There's a wonderful quote from an old case, and I love to quote it, and Justice Gates quoted it as well, where in an old case, justice from the Supreme Court of Canada said that freedom of expression is a little less vital to man's mind and spirit as breathing is to his physical existence. These long-held freedoms are in the heart, I believe, of every individual. And if we don't watch carefully, the right to express ourselves, that age-old principle, will be eroded. And it's so crucial to our soul, just like breathing is to our physical existence, that we need to guard that right for expression on either side of every issue so that we can continue to flourish as a democracy.
And looking ahead, Carol, where do you see the free speech issue and also the abortion issue headed over the next decade or so?
Well, I can't really speak to the abortion issue myself because I'm a free speech lawyer, and that's really the legal basis on which I stand to support these clients. But I can speak to free speech, and I hope that all of us are vigilant in guarding that right so that 10 years from now, Jeanette, as we project, there will be still the free expression, the free exchange of ideas so that we can move forward to see further progress in our society.
And with that, Carol, it looks like we are about out of time. Carol Croston is a Calgary constitutional lawyer out of Airdrie, Alberta. Carol, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Jeanette. Happy to be with you.
The idea of introducing a wealth tax in Canada for the richest individuals in our country has been gaining steam recently, and it seems a lot of Canadians like this concept. But is it actually a good idea? Today's guest is Philip Cross. He is the former Chief Economic Analyst for Stats Canada and a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute. He's the author of a new report called Does Canada Need a Wealth Tax? And you can find that at FraserInstitute.org. Philip, thank you so much for being with us today. He joins us via Skype from Ottawa.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Now, Philip, can you first of all explain exactly what a wealth tax is, how it works, and who it would apply to?
Sure. Well, a wealth tax isn't that esoteric an idea. It works a lot like a property tax, and I think most people know how a property tax works. The city comes along, it evaluates your property to be worth a certain amount of money, and then it's taxed at a rate of 2 or 3%. The only difference between a property tax and a wealth tax is a wealth tax should deduct out your liabilities. So, for example, instead of just taxing the value of your home, it would be the net value of your value less your mortgage. So, but a wealth tax basically works along the same principles.
But it would apply to certain individuals making a certain income, right?
It it most likely would. I mean, I think the idea is to shift the tax burden to wealthier people. So that also makes it different from a property tax. Almost all property owners pay a property tax, but a wealth tax, at least the way it's being proposed in the United States by people such as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and up here by the NDP in Canada, it's meant to be targeted people earning, say $400,000 or more.
I see. Okay, so why are so many Canadians in favor of a wealth tax? Is it because the idea that a large gap in wealth inequality is a bad thing?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure. I haven't seen, when I was doing the research for this paper, I didn't see any evidence of, X% of Canadians were in favor of a wealth tax. I did notice that the NDP, who are the one party that advocated, didn't do very well in the last election. So, and similarly, we saw that Sanders and Warren in the United States lost the Democratic nomination, of course, to Joe Biden. So, those people who have proposed the wealth tax actually haven't done well with the electorate. So I'm not sure how widespread the idea is, but you can sort of see the idea, the appeal of the idea is that in a time when we're running such massive government deficits, of course, we're starting to look for who's going to pay for this. And the reflexive idea is always, well, let's just pass this burden on to a small number of wealthy people or a small number of corporations, and we, the vast majority of ordinary Canadians, will not bear the burden. And of course, it doesn't work out that way in real life. We know that when we hit the fiscal wall in the mid 90s, for example, it was the average Canadian who bore the brunt of tax increases. Quebec, for example, is very well known for its social democratic leanings. And yet, when they faced a deficit coming out of the 08-09 recession, they increased 4 taxes that affected the ordinary person. The sales tax went up 2 percentage points, the health care premium went up, tuition fees went up, and the tax on gasoline went up. So that's typically when governments need large quantities of money, frankly, they have to tax wide swaths of the population. The idea that we can get a small group of people to bear a large amount of the fiscal burden never works out. But initially, as I say, it's always people's reflexive solution when they're faced with a big fiscal challenge.
Okay, so how much of a wealth gap is there in Canada, and is it currently growing or is it shrinking?
Well, the wealth gap in Canada is much less marked than in the United States. The same is also true of income. And of course, wealth is really just, in some sense, income built up over time. You can have a high income for 1 year and not be very wealthy. But if you have a high income for several years, eventually you'll break into the top X%. What's interesting is Statistics Canada just started collecting wealth data after the 08-09 recession, when interest in wealth became much more widespread. And I was there at the time when we started this wealth survey. And what it shows is that over the last decade, the concentration of wealth amongst the richest Canadians has actually declined. So we're actually going in the opposite direction for the US. But as I say, I often find that we import a lot of these narratives directly from the US without correcting them for the facts on the ground here in Canada. And I think the idea of a wealth tax is another good example of that.
What are some of the cons of a wealth tax? I understand that it might be quite complicated and costly to administer.
It's costly to administer. It doesn't raise a lot of money. We have a lot of experience with European countries, and they haven't been able to raise a lot of money. The net revenues are further reduced by it's very complicated to administer. And it really doesn't do much to change inequality either. So it hasn't proven, even if you're worried about inequality, and as I say, it's been falling in Canada, but even then, if you thought inequality was something that needs to be corrected, a wealth tax is probably not the way to go. It has proven to be not a very effective tool.
Now, Philip, you write that a wealth tax would constrain economic growth. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, well, basically the idea is that a wealth tax would encourage consumption. It actually penalizes savings. If I had recently signed a big contract with the Vancouver Canucks, for example, for a couple $1 million, if I go out and spend all that money on travel around the world and whining and dining with my friends, that's okay. But if I save that money and reinvest it in a corporation, that would be penalized. So a wealth tax actually penalizes the very behavior that we know is best for an economy in the long term, which is saving and investment. And it rewards people who engage in frivolous consumption. So we really get all our economic incentives backwards with a wealth tax. So I think in the simplest terms, that's why it isn't good for economic growth in the long term. It's like low interest rates. It rewards people going into debt and penalize people who save. And we know in the long run, that's the exact opposite of the incentives we want to.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at that for sure. What can we learn from other nations who have implemented wealth taxes over the years?
Well, we do have a large number of European nations whose experience we can draw on. Starting in the mid 1980s, 14 European nations introduced a wealth tax of various forms and various severity. It's very instructive that 10 of them have given up. They just found it. In the case of Germany, the courts ruled it unconstitutional. In the case of France, they found that wealthy people were leaving the country. So they in Denmark found it was just too complicated to administer. So I think it's very instructive that most European countries gave up on trying to implement it, and those who have retained it have maintained very low tax rates. They define a very narrow base to which it's applied. It seems to be, frankly, largely token that they're keeping it even on the books. It doesn't raise significant revenues, less than 1% of GDP. It doesn't do much to change inequality. So it seems to be sort of like our carbon tax here in Canada. We slap a $20 carbon tax. We say, yippee, we've done something for the environment. And then we just jump in our cars and drive off to work as usual. It smacks of tokenism.
Now, Philip, is there any evidence that a wealth tax will actually cause wealthy individuals to move their business interests to other countries?
Yes, France in particular is very instructive in that regard. The French, when they abandoned their wealth tax, that was the number one reason they did it, was they found people were moving to other countries. The best example is Gerard Depardieu. I might be mispronouncing that, but the most famous actor in France, he very famously, in response to a wealth tax, just moved across the border to Belgium. So he was the most high-profile case. But we've seen this in other countries. There's a lot of evidence in the US, for example, that if you slap an estate tax, which is a tax on wealth of people when they die, that people will move from states that have a wealth tax or an estate tax to states that don't have one, and almost nobody moves back in the other direction. So there seems to be a lot of evidence that actually that people vote with their feet and they do move to avoid a wealth tax.
Now, how do business people typically view a wealth tax? Does it remove incentive to earn more income?
In the long run, yes, but it's much more of a concern that it removes the incentive to save and invest, and partly as a result. And most people, by the way, are don't want. Everybody holds various forms of wealth. Most Canadians hold wealth, but it's usually in the form of housing and pension savings. So the first thing that most politicians do is they say, well, of course, housing and pension savings are going to be exempt. Well, when you do that, 70% of wealth is exempt, and you end up applying a wealth tax to a very small number of assets, such as small businesses or investment funds and so on. So it tends not to, in practice, to not affect very many assets, and that's part of the problem. It ends up not being a very large tax and rather inconsequential in its effect.
Now, can this affect average Canadians in the fact of, like, let's say a business wants to create fewer jobs because of, trying to avoid the wealth tax, right? Could this impact average Canadian workers?
Oh, it certainly could. In particular, I'd be quite concerned about its rate of a business formation. We're coming through a very severe crisis now. We know the number of businesses going bankrupt is rising and likely to rise quite sharply this fall and winter. We're going to need young people, especially, to come along and found new businesses to take the place. And new businesses in particular, they'll have a lot of debt when they're starting out. So unless you allow for that and correct for that, you can end up creating a lot of liquidity problems for new startups. They're suddenly going to be faced with a new tax on their assets. And for a lot of new firms starting out, this can, really stop them from growing. So, especially at this moment of history, when we want to encourage businesses to continue and new firms to start up, a wealth tax actually sends the exact opposite signal to investors.
Interesting. Now, are there some pros to a wealth tax? There have been a number of billionaires who say they actually support higher taxes for the extreme rich.
Yeah. Well, and yes, and I think those people should feel free. I mean, Warren Buffett is the most obvious example. He's spoken about how he should pay more taxes. I never understood, why doesn't Warren Buffett just write a check to the government of the United States and any other millionaires, billionaires out there who feel they have too much money, and if they can't find my address, then they can, send their money to the government of Canada. I'm sure they'll be happy to cash a check. The problem is that the fact that, certain individuals, a lot of the heirs of the Disney family, for example, signed this petition. Well, if you feel guilty about the money you inherited and you don't feel that you've earned it, as I say, feel free to send money to the government, but you are not free to impose those same views on other people who don't share them. And this comes back down to, a fundamental matter of liberty and freedom in our society. The other thing is, as an economist, I would say it's much more efficient to tax the income, the capital income that wealth generates. We want to encourage people to invest. Let people invest. Then when they make money on their capital gains or they pay out dividends, tax those forms of income. That's a much more efficient way. That's not going to deter the original investments in wealth creation, and yet it will lay a tax on that capital income. So there are, economists would argue, there are much more efficient and ways of taxing capital income without the distorting effects on savings and investment that come from a wealth tax.
Now, Philip, with the younger generation increasingly demanding some kind of a wealth tax for the rich in order to close that wealth gap, would you care to venture a guess as to whether or not we will see a wealth tax in Canada within the next decade or two?
I'd be surprised. I mean, I think to do so, we would have to close our eyes to all the evidence that's been coming from Europe and other countries that this just hasn't proved to be a very good solution. There are other ways of, if you are worried about inequality, and as I say, in Canada, inequality is declining, and yet we continue to import this narrative from the US that inequality is increasing. But even if we do believe in this false narrative, there are more effective ways of dealing with it. As I say, there are ways of taxing income, and especially capital income, that don't have any of the really negative consequences of a wealth tax that have made it such an ineffective tool. So, I really think, I hope that wiser heads will prevail and will learn from the experience of other countries and will adopt better, more effective ways of dealing with these problems.
And with that, Philip, it looks like we are about out of time. So thanks so much, Philip, for being here with us today. Philip Cross, author of a new report, Does Canada Need a Wealth Tax? That is available at FraserInstitute.org. Thanks so much, Philip.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Dan McTagg was a Liberal MP for Pickering-Ajax and Pickering-Scarborough East from the mid-90s until 2011. Dan is now a businessman who runs Canadians for Affordable Energy, a company which supports Canada's energy sector. Today, we're not here to talk about so much about oil and gas, but about how Dan barely recognizes the current Liberal Party of today compared to when he was a member of Parliament. Dan, how is the Trudeau Liberal Party different from when you served under former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien?
Well, the party I knew, grew up with, spent 38 years in, devoted half of that time as a member of Parliament and some of that on the front benches as a Privy Councillor, was really a balanced, moderate party, a party that had struggled with, obviously, with national unity, struggled with debts and deficits, struggled, of course, with ensuring that all representation in the country was honored. The previous time, of course, you saw no representation or very little representation out west. So an effort was made to ensure there was as much inclusiveness as possible. All of the ideas, no matter where they were from across the regions and across the ideological spectrum, given the diversity of the country, was very well reflected in the governments of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, and even subsequent leaders after that, right up until, of course, 2011, when most Liberals were eliminated. But it is a very different party than the party that we knew, and certainly ones that I think many people assume still exist in so many ways, ideology, but most importantly, not so much, I think, a party that now is really founded on the issue of the cult of personality only.
So Dan, why do you think Justin Trudeau has moved so far to the left? The old Liberal Party was more of a centrist party, was it not?
It was. It was a very, big tent party. Everyone brought in ideas well respected, ideas shared, often debated. You won a few, you lost a few, but at the end of this, you still had a place there. Trudeau came in with two factors. One, the party recognizing that its lunch had been eaten by Jack Layton in 2011, and that it was either going to be a right or left situation. It gave, of course, Mr. Harper quite a bit of room to maneuver back to the center. The decision was made by Trudeau and his group that he would take over the far left. In fact, it wasn't lost on most that in the 2015 election, Mr. Trudeau was more NDP than the leader of the NDP at the time, Thomas Mulcair, in terms of deficits and spending and responsibility. That had been completely thrown out the door in favor of let's just do what we want, let's spend with abandon, let's bring in all sorts of wonderful ideas that'll re-energize the young vote, in particular pot legislation. A terrible thing to think about, that's really legislation that was the most important thing the government could bring forward. But that's really where I think things came off the rails. Then, of course, we see a government here that has no difficulty, no trepidation whatsoever in engaging in battles that are regional and causing frustration, the likes of which we haven't seen in 30 to 40 years.
Dan, many Canadians are concerned that the Trudeau Liberals are leading Canada towards a socialist government. Now, do you share that same concern? And if so, why?
I think so. And certainly the pandemic has permitted them to pretty much spend with abandon, to bring in ideas of a guaranteed annual income, but also, I think, to create a bit of a wedge so that if people have a traditional view, whether that be in terms of energy versus climate, whether that be religion, whether that be language, whether that be concerns about migration, all of these issues which were once debated in a very healthy and open way, not just within the Liberal Party, but across the country, I'm now seeing a sort of divide and conquer of this sort of moral absolutism. And it really does fall into the category of it's either our way or there's no way. Very typical of the socialist dialogue, which of course goes along the lines of, if you don't agree with us, then you must be a terrible person, or using language that is condescending, that debases somebody simply because they bring forth a legitimate point, or they simply brand them as xenophobics, racists, climate deniers, take your pick. These are things that Liberals would debate in the past, and debate from a position of respect and responsibility. They don't do that anymore. It's simply easy to label, pay some in the media $600 million a year, pay the CBC $1.6 billion a year, and you'll have a, if you will, a fifth column supporting this kind of nonsense. So the party hasn't just changed. It's also been able to change the narrative, and it's a very dangerous one because it risks not only damaging the unity of the country, but also, I think, the social fabric which has kept this country together over years.
My father used to say, it's my way or the highway. It didn't work for me then, and it doesn't work for me now. Now, Dan, you must keep in contact with some of the current Liberal MPs. Are they also concerned with the direction that this government is headed?
Privately, they are, but many of them recognize that they wouldn't have been elected without the name Trudeau. The name Trudeau, for a lot of people, evokes this idea of strong Canadian government, independent view, experimenting with new policies, and sort of differing ourselves from those terrible American politicians and the way they do things down there. It's a little bit of contempt, and it's certainly not justified. It's for that reason I think many of us are concerned, and I think I have spoken to some former Liberal senators, some of my former colleagues as well. You won't hear them being involved at all. They're not going to take to the airwaves. They're not going to talk about these things. They're not going to talk about affordability, but they are very, very concerned. This is not in any way, shape, or form the same Liberal Party that we remembered just a decade ago.
So Dan, why have the various scandals which have rocked Justin Trudeau not really hurt him nationally in the polls? And I'm speaking, of course, of the We Charity scandal, SNC-Lavalin affair, the Aga Khan, and of course, remember the blackface controversy. Some call our Prime Minister the Teflon man because nothing really sticks to him.
Well, he makes deals. Let's be honest, the NDP is, for all intents and purposes, has now become an appendage of the Liberal Party. It doesn't exist other than to support the Liberal Party, and it may be big on bluster, but it doesn't have anything really to represent. The Liberals have stolen all their ideas. Now, that's not new. NDP ideas have been taken in the past, but not to the extent that NDP hasn't just had their policies taken. It's that NDP and Green policies have been completely outflanked. The Liberals are 5 steps ahead of them in terms of their radicalness. And at this point, because of the pandemic, the Liberals have been given probably a good year, but they now have a situation where there's no accountability. There's no one holding them to it. You see, for instance, today, the parliamentary budget officer saying, there is no accountability for what you have done. These should be setting off alarm bells. How are we going to pay a massive debt the size of which we've accumulated for all the reasons that we've said, and those things which we don't know about, the infrastructure spending? We can talk about the scandals about we and SNC-Lavalin. That's small stuff compared to the fact that there has been no rigorous accountability in the rules that have traditionally applied to spending to maintain our financial integrity in this country have now been completely thrown out the window. It's not just dangerous for the Liberals. It's very dangerous for every Canadian who pays a tax in this country and for the next generations to come. We're in very serious, deep trouble in this country financially, and that's likely to allow, well, parties like the Bloc Québécois to say the country's bankrupt and broke. Let's just move on. Let's do our own thing. So what you reap, you now sow, and I think the Liberals, particularly Trudeau, all of those things that he's done over the years are now starting to come to gather fruit for those who do want to see harm to this country.
You know, many in Alberta feel a real disconnect with Ottawa right now. What can the Liberals do to really bridge the gap with not just Albertans, but many of the prairie provinces?
Well, I'd say get rid of Mr. Trudeau, but I think you have to understand that the people behind him are the same ones that created division and rancor, for which we're still paying for here in Ontario with hydro rates. We just saw another increase on the weekend. The ideological underpinnings of the people around the Trudeau gang are highly elitist. They are highly deferential to their own group, and they're highly exclusive. And it's not, by the way, we talked a little bit about other things where there's exclusion. Age is also an issue with them. They don't like people who have experience, and they don't like people who can stand up and who can debate. It's one of the reasons why this Prime Minister is the first Liberal leader I've known who allows and encourages, in fact, brings in his own Prime Minister's staff to take notes on errant MPs who might say something bad about the Prime Minister. It's not just a Teflon Prime Minister. It's that this Prime Minister has no clothes. The Emperor literally walks around and is saluted everywhere he goes. He doesn't have a lot of opposition from the inside, and it doesn't seem like he has a lot of accountability from the media. Hopefully, perhaps there might be a Biden presidency. I don't know, but that allows some Canadian media to take its attention off our, obsession with the U.S. politics and Trump and start focusing on what have been the misdeeds of this Prime Minister, who by any account should not be the Prime Minister of this country, certainly if we want to maintain the financial and unity of this nation, which is badly fragmented because of Justin Trudeau's divisive policies. And it's not just language, it's not just regionalism, it's not just age, it's also his energy policies, which have been deliberately designed to destroy and to undermine Canada's most important economic engine, its oil and gas sector. I'm not here to preach for the oil and gas sector. I'm simply here to say that without it, I won't have a pension. My family physician won't have a job. Nurses and teachers will have a hard time making go. Social programs are on the line. You can't do away with the most important sector in this economy while spending through the roof as Justin Trudeau has done.
So why do you think the Trudeau Liberals are so dead set against Alberta's energy sector? I mean, doesn't the Prime Minister realize that there are billions of dollars sitting on the table with oil and gas that can contribute to our economy and help bring down that $1.3 trillion debt and maybe help get the budget under control during a pandemic?
Well, let's put the facts in perspective. If I were to get rid of the oil and gas sector tomorrow, how would I make up the $60 to $50 billion a year in revenues it generates in economic activity? How would I maintain a Canadian dollar, which is reliant very much on our greatest exports, and whose devaluation would mean massive inflation in Canada? And that doesn't just include the fact that 10 to 20% of your economy would be flat on its back. Most people would be out of work. And by the way, I'm from Ontario. I'd like to remind Ontarians that $161 billion in purchasing of financial assets, of insurance to banking to things like manufacturing. That's $40 billion a year in economic activity to my province in Ontario because of a healthy oil and gas sector. So if Canadians in my area, in my former riding, think that that's nothing to sneeze at and you can just walk away from it, go ahead. But if you're a nurse, you're a teacher, you're working for the public sector, you're depending on social safety nets, say goodbye to them, because what the Prime Minister has done in this country is undermine the most important, significant economic engine that we have, while at the same time creating an environment that makes it impossible for us to repay those debts. Now, of course, you can talk about modern monetary theory and all these wonderful, wacky left-wing ideas. You got to pay the piper sooner or later. We borrowed a lot of money. You got to kind of pay it back. And you can't pay it back if your economy isn't just not growing, it's actually stultifying. It's actually in free fall, which the Canadian economy is right now.
Dan, what can the Trudeau Liberals do to really strengthen our relationship with the United States? Many would argue that it's quite strained right now.
I'm not sure what can be done. I think the Prime Minister has to make a decision on Keystone XL. I think that's the first one, whoever the President of the United States is going to be, especially if it's President Biden, who isn't just about to take a steamroller to the entire energy sector of the United States. By the way, good luck with that. The Americans will get an experience of what we've been having up here for quite some time about what happens when you do that. But Keystone XL has to go through. The Americans need our oil. I want to make that really clear. Venezuela can't sell it. Iran can't sell it. Mexico can't sell heavy oil. Half of the U.S. refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast and the U.S. PAD 2, which of course is the U.S. Central Market, requires heavy Canadian oil in order to process. And they've made massive investments in upgrading those refineries. So if you don't have a Keystone XL, good luck with that, because Canada isn't just Canada that's going to suffer, it's actually Americans. And last time I checked, they still need diesel for transport. They still need diesel to run their armed forces, their tractors, and their mining. No one has that kind of heavy oil. And those who think it's just not important, or it's trivial, or it's dangerous, or whatever the case may be, are dreaming Technicolor.
What do you feel are the fundamental differences between Conservative leader Erin O'Toole and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? Why, maybe in your opinion, potentially would O'Toole make a better Prime Minister than Mr. Trudeau?
Well, I know Erin very well. I know him. He was part of his area where he represents Durham was actually part of my old riding in Uxbridge. So we've had similar areas over different times. Distinguished himself radically from Justin Trudeau, not just on the financial side, but to find a way in which he can find a middle road. I think it's probably helpful. He's good friends with the Premier of Alberta. That's a good start. I would be concerned, though, and I have blogged about this, my concern about Mr. O'Toole, as I did with 2 or 3 other Conservative leadership contenders, and their adherence to the Paris Climate Agreement, which the Americans pulled out of officially last evening. The concern I have is that it imposes a very significant restriction on Canadians, does not give us credit for the natural gas and the clean energy that we've developed. It doesn't even use the proper date. We were a country that went to natural gas and made those conversions away from coal and other forms of fossil fuels before 2005. Now you're saying, well, you have to still get 30% less than 2005. Easy for our friends in the United States to do that. They did it after 2005. So, when the Prime Minister signed that little agreement, and we hear Mr. O'Toole and others saying, hey, maybe we should stick with it, I think we have to really understand what it's done. China's about to build 300 to 400 coal plants and increase in perhaps as little as 1 year, what Canada uses in about 2 to 3 weeks in terms of emissions. We have a solution. Let's get that natural gas over to them. But we don't get credit on the Paris Climate Agreement for that. I think if Mr. O'Toole were to demonstrate to folks like me that he's serious about being responsible, it would be to ensure that you don't stay on to an agreement that does so much fundamental damage to Canada's economic aspirations.
Former Liberal MP and now President for the Canadians for Affordable Energy, Dan McTeague, thanks for joining me today from Oakville, Ontario.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Al.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and thanks for watching.